Hello, and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Center. My name is Benedicte, and I'm the Communications Officer here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, www.iea-coal.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our report at no charge after a one-off registration. The subject for today's webinar is Trends and Challenges in the Coking Coal Market, presented by Paul Pereira. The report on this topic will be published fairly soon, in a matter of weeks. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Benedict. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us, wherever you're listening from. I'm Paul Pereira, presenting from in London, UK. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on coking coal and steel trends. This accompanies a report, as Benedict has said, which is currently in draft and undergoing editing prior to peer review, so it's still a few weeks away. But please keep an eye out on our website. The date of publication will be issued in due course. So please keep an eye out or follow us on social media. Just a quick introduction to who we are, in case you don't know the Clean Coal Center. We're a technology collaboration program of the IEA in Paris. A technology collaboration program consists of several programs, including transport, renewables and buildings. And of course, we come under the fossil fuel umbrella, focusing on the clean and best practice approach to getting value from coal. We're separately funded and we're fully autonomous from the IEA regards to the management, and we're independent in our work. And all of my comments and findings do not represent the opinions of the IEA unless they're specifically cited. Now, our own separate executive committee steers our work direction. So if you want to help us steer our work and topics that you want to know more about, please don't hesitate to get in touch about being a member of the Clean Coal Center. Now, let me just give you a quick introduction of the talk for the next 3/4 of an hour or so. I'm going to guide those of you who are less familiar with steel production and coking coal through the steel production process while avoiding chemistry and equations, so I'll keep it simple. I'll look at how coking coal is used as a source of carbon for the purpose of making iron. I'll look at where coking coal comes from and who the big users are, and finish off with examining some of the challenges and issues facing coal-based steel production. And towards the end, hopefully you'll understand more about coking coal and steel. So first of all, an introduction to the steel-making process. So this graphic illustrates the various pathways of steel production. And here we go, I've got my mouse going. And on the left side of the slide, here is the steel processes that rely mainly on raw mined materials. And this is the blast furnace routes for iron making that uses large amounts of coal and ore to produce molten pig iron. The right-hand side is the pathway that generally avoids the blast furnace route and relies mainly on scrap steel and sponge iron, which is also produced from ore and coal. However, this section here on what you call direct reduction iron only accounts for 7% of world iron production. The EF production of steel down here in the bottom right-hand corner only accounts for 30% of steel production. Over here on the bottom left, open hearth furnace only accounts for 0.5% of steel production, which is why we'll focus on this pathway here, which accounts for most of the steel that's produced in the world today. And this is known as the blast furnace or basic oxygen furnace process, or BF-BOF, or simply just the blast furnace process, short, I suppose, and is the primary coal-based form of producing steel today. The first stage is raw material preparation. We start with iron ore, which is mined ore, which is screened and sized into lumps and mixed with reformed fine ore dust, which is in the form of lumps and pellets, which little agglomerated lumps, which can be formed in the sintering plant and in pelleting processing. The iron ore comes in the form of hematite, Fe2O3, or magnetite, 304, but there is a whole plethora of different iron oxides in the natural world, which is mine today. But we're interested in coking coal mainly, which is the main feedstock for the coking plant, which we'll discuss in a moment. And this pathway then goes into the iron making, involving the production of pig iron by reducing iron ore to metallic iron with quite a high carbon content. In this case, will be 4% carbon or thereabouts. It's called pig iron because it refers to the traditional shapes or molds that iron makers used to use, which was appeared to be in the shape of a pig in the plant, so hence that unusual name. Oh, beg your pardon, sorry. The steel-making basic oxygen furnace here refines the relatively high carbon steel by reducing the carbon content to less than 1.5%, and at this stage removing all other impurities, finally producing crude steel, which then can be alloyed, formed into desired shapes such as slabs, coils, and beams for further reforming and bulk. Now let's focus on coking coal. Coking coal, this is effectively almost the end of the journey for coking coal, because this is where it gets converted into coke in coke ovens. These coke ovens are roughly anything up to 7 meters high, just half a meter wide, and anything up to 15 meters deep. So it's, if you imagine the sort of dimensions you have for a sort of like a domestic toaster slot, it's kind of like putting coal into one of those. The ovens can be top loaded or side loaded, and 30 to 70 of these slender ovens can be arranged side by side to form what we call a coke battery. One or more batteries can be used in parallel, depending on the scale of the plant, producing up to several million tons a year. Each oven is sealed, and the coal is then heated to 1000 degrees centigrade, or roughly 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and done in the absence of oxygen. Coal then releases volatiles and moisture without combusting them, and these volatiles then captured and reused elsewhere. After 12 to 36 hours of heating, the coal is turned plastic, it's released its volatiles and moisture, and then it cools into a mass with a very high carbon content. Low rank steam coals can be used, but generally leads to poorer quality cokes, albeit cheaper to buy, but smaller amounts can be used without doing too much harm. Now, the coke is then extracted and quenched before it goes to the blast furnace, and it's important for the coke to be a stable mass rather than a friable mass. It needs to form a structure in the blast furnace that permits gases to pass through the bed of coke and ore of hot solid material for reduction of the ore to take place. Now, mineral matter can be a problem in coking coal. An internationally traded coking coal should be less than 10% ash because a rise in ash content effectively requires more coal throughput per ton of coke, requiring more energy and increases the need for maintenance in the coke ovens. Steelmakers are always keen to find alternatives to coke to reduce costs, but also to prolong the life of their coke ovens. And so few alternatives exist that can replace coking coal in terms of quality, abundance, and cost. But as a general rule, 1 ton of coke requires 1.3 tons of coking coal. In the blast furnace here, they've got a diagram, the right, a schematic, and coke serves several purposes here. It's layered with iron ore and limestones, and the coke acts as a heat carrier and as a reducing agent. The coke is fed by gravity, as I said, into the layers, and the high temperatures at the bottom of the blast furnace is ignited either using pulverized coal injection coal or gas or oil to sustain heats, which forms CO2, which then reacts with more coke to form carbon monoxide. Now that carbon monoxide then migrates through the layers and the pores in these layer structures upwards, forced by extremely strong currents of hot air from the toyers at the bottom. And this reduces the iron oxide in the upper layers of the furnace. In the middle, limestone decomposes and combines with silica and silicates in the iron ore to form slag, which then tapped off to waste. The molten metallic iron or pig iron, along with the molten slag, then descend through the layers and are tapped at the bottom of the blast furnace. Just a quick discussion on pulverized coal injection. Aside from coking coal, this PCI coal is a finely milled steam coal that's injected directly in the base of the blast furnace near where the air enters at high velocities. The PCI coal is generally a low volatile bituminous steam coal with very high heating values. I've seen heating values of anything 7,000 to 7,800 kilocalories per kilogram published versus say 3,300 to 6,700 kilocalories for a typical steam coal. A PCI coal will be very low in sulfur, so less than 0.5% sulfur content. It should have less than 10% low ash content. Although, as I said before, lignites and anthracites can be used in the process, but more in limited amounts. And typically 1 ton of PCI coal consumes roughly 1 ton of coking coal in the process. And this is good because, of course, as I said before, reducing coking coal throughput in the coking process reduces wear and tear on the coking ovens, reduces energy and therefore emissions associated with coke production. The final stage of crude steel production converts the pig iron, which has 4% carbon content, into a crude steel, which will have ultimately a carbon content of less than 1.5%, sometimes a fraction of percent of carbon, depending on what's required. Pure oxygen is injected at supersonic velocities into the molten mix of iron and scrap steel. The scrap acts as a temperature moderator as well inside the basic oxygen furnace, which you see up in the top right here. The oxygen oxidizes most of the remaining carbon to form carbon monoxide and CO2, as well as oxidizing other contaminants to form slag for later removal. Like the blast furnace process, the interactions between the oxygen, the carbon, the ore, and the additives and other compounds is a very complex process. There's a whole series of chemical equations involved in that. So, but I won't have time to cover that here. But overall, by this stage, the integrated steel mill has probably consumed about 800 kilograms of coking coal, up to 200 kilograms of PCI coal, maybe 100 kilograms of steam coal to produce a single ton of steel, as well as all the other raw materials that you can see here. So where does coking coal come from? Now, this next map perfectly illustrates the pattern of coking coal use in the world today. It shows the flow of internationally traded coal in 2017 and 2018. It's published by the IEA. And overall, coking coal trade adds up to roughly 300 to 330 million tons. Versus steam coal international trade, which is 1,100 million tons. It's a much smaller market in volume terms, at least. The thickness of the arrows here shows in proportion to the volumes that are exported. And so you can see here clearly that the leading exporter in the world is Australia, which accounts for roughly 55% of the trade that you see in this map. And now the interesting pattern is where it's going. Here is the leading importer and the largest overall consumer of coking coal, because this is the region that's the leading producer of steel as well. Other trade regions include Europe, and coking coal going into there, chiefly OECD Europe, and also Turkey as well, which is another major importer into that region. Now, if we turn to the main coal exporters, the table shows the same data from the previous map, along with their relative production levels and imports as well. The exports are negative here, as you see, because it's a balancing against the positive addition in the country for production and imports. The producers here export, as I said, the majority of the coking coal, but they export a majority of what they produce, with the exception of Russia, which actually retains most of the coal that it produces for domestic steel production. But what's most interesting, if you look at the bottom two rows, is the emergence of these promising exporters, such as Mozambique and Mongolia. All of Mongolia's exports are railed over land into China across the border, into the provinces close to the Mongolian border. And Mozambique ships most of its coal to Asia with very close shipping distances to India in particular. Both countries are recognised as having vast reserves of very high quality, low cost coking coal, although they have faced their challenges because these two countries have emerged in the last sort of 10 years, sort of during the period of the commodity crisis. So these countries have done very well to hang in there and increase their business. And all of these countries are discussed in turn in much more detail in the forthcoming reports with maps and details of production and companies operating here. Now, turning to the major imports of coke and coal, which are listed in the table on the left here. Asian countries account for 6 of the 10 top importing countries of coke and coal. And Asia, as I mentioned before, was the major driver of demand for seaborne traded coal, coking, and steam. China is the world's top importer, followed by India, Japan, and Korea. However, the supply circumstances are slightly different for these countries. 90% of China's coke and coal is actually produced domestically, and the rest is imported, as you can see here. Yet it's still the top importer in the world. So events that happen within China in its domestic coal market and steel markets, that certainly has an impact on the rest of the seaborne market as well. India relies on 50% of its supplies come from imports, so it relies pretty heavily on imports, surprisingly, despite the fact that there is an abundance of coal in the country. It's just not of the necessarily of the quality or the coking variety that the country requires. But Japan and Korea, however, have completely entirely different supply profile, where nearly 100% of their coke and coal is all imported and comes from the seaborne market. Now, if we look at the other major importers, Ukraine, Germany, Turkey, and Brazil, they're also major importers, but again, they rely heavily, with anything up to 90% of their supplies coming from the seaborne market as well. In total, roughly 300 million tonnes was imported in 2018. So we've discussed the steel market process, and we just touched on coke and coal trade. Now let's turn to broader steel production trends and see what it could mean for coke and coal demand. World steel production has doubled since 2000 to 1,870 million tonnes. More than 70% was produced in Asia in 2019. 2019 saw a major boost versus the previous year, of an increase of almost 6%. Although by the end of 2019, of course, the beginning of 2020, we've seen the trend take quite a downward trajectory, which we'll discuss a little later. The growth in steel production last year was attributed mainly to the big 2 non-OECD Asian economies, China and India. And China's actually increased its share of world production last year from 51% to 53%, meaning its influence on world steel and coke and coal markets can be felt even more. Now, these tables break down the proportion of steel that is produced by different methods. So we've got here along the top the blast furnace basic oxygen, electric arc furnace, and the open hearth furnace methods of steel production. And if we go straight to the top at the EU 28, you can see the EU still gets almost 60% of its steel from the blast furnace method. But the region we want to look at is further down the table is Asia, where 80% is produced from the blast furnace basic oxygen method. Now, if we look at the bottom table, which is of which, and then break down the separate countries, pardon me, I'd just like you to look at India for a moment, which seems to be an outlier for Asia. So even though I said that Asia, 80% is production comes from the blast furnace method, India produces 45% of its steel using the blast furnace method, but most of it actually comes from the electric arc EAF process. India makes use of actual direct reduction iron making, so it reduces its iron ore in a very different way and doesn't use blast furnace. Although it still uses coal, it actually reduces iron ore using a solid state process called direct reduction. But the future of DRI is somewhat mixed. Although India is one of the leading producer of iron, sponge iron, using DRI, along with Iran as well, China has recently closed a whole swathe of DRI production capacity as well. So it's contracting. But DRI is also one of the other promising possibilities for future lower carbon steel manufacturing. We'll talk about a little later. If you go up If you go down the table a little more, go to the USA, surprisingly, I didn't realize, having seen this data, that the US relies heavily on electric processes as well. And you can see here that just 32% of steel comes from the blast furnace, and the remainder comes from EAF furnaces. So therefore, its coking coal requirements are surprisingly low, sort of million tons in its 20s, between 20 and 30 million tons. This is a chart that shows the plant utilization of steel plants fluctuating since 2000 to 2018 as a percentage of total production capacity. Now, in the past, steel industry has suffered from excess capacity, with capacity perhaps increasing faster than demand. In past years, leading to a fall of plant utilizations between 2006 and 2015. However, China took steps to sort this out, and the rationalization of the steel industry meant that the utilization then was boosted from 75 to 85%, pushing up the worldwide average of plant utilization. This was done through the closure of inefficient, more highly polluting steel plants, creating sort of the mega mergers of some of China's largest steel companies, forming these gigantic steel companies, and these are all discussed here in the forthcoming report. So the drive to have a much more modern, more efficient and cleaner steel industry has meant that the utilization has also been boosted, and we've got a much more productive industry worldwide. Now, I talked about the events in late 2019 into early 2020, as we're more than aware, has created a shock to society in the world economy from the COVID-19 pandemic. No one really knows for sure where the world steel sector is going to go and when it will return to pre-COVID normality. But overall, we've seen steel production fall by roughly 1% in the first quarter of 2020 versus the first quarter of 2019. Looking at different regional changes, Europe appears to have taken a more severe hit than some of the other regions. And a sustainable recovery or a stagnation in steel production is still difficult to foresee. It's literally the prospects of changing on a day-to-day basis. The prospects of steel production will really depend on the exit strategies for countries, and of course it may occur in a staggered fashion with different countries opening up and going back to normality at different rates. China appears to already be going back to normality quicker than others, and output from steel using sectors, the automotive sectors, real estate, manufacturing, engineering has also been somewhat mixed. This will be dependent on quantitative easing and the effects of any economic stimulus, and of course, as I've mentioned, the lockdown exit strategies and their impact on heavy industry. Again, as I said, there's different to foresee. The UK, for instance, is easing lockdown, but already in the UK, working practices in every workplace has to be carefully reviewed, and especially in somewhere like a steel mill, where these workplaces are particularly hazardous, and so opening up those will require great deal of management. Now, generally, all steelmaking processes are energy and emission intensive processes, and CO2 emissions come from process reactions, rather like in the cement industry. These emissions are very much difficult to avoid. If you consider, it's rather like akin to reducing emissions from exhaling. It's something you cannot do. So it's process emissions from CO2 from iron making is almost impossible to alleviate with some form of capturing down the latter part of the process, but we'll look at that in a little later. One solution that seems to be discussed in the wider media and analysts is producing more steel from electric arc furnace methods, so electrifying the steel industry. The electric arc furnace emits around 400 kilograms of CO2 per ton of crude steel, and the blast furnace basic oxygen process emits 1,700 kilograms, and the DRI emits even more the ton of steel. Now, when one looks also at the costs, the full costs, unit costs of steel making, comparing electric arc furnaces versus blast furnace-based steel, they're broadly similar when one considers operational capital costs, roughly $400 per ton. However, the two processes are different, and they're suited for different locations and different geographical circumstances. The EAF is particularly sensitive to the price of local price of scrap steel, or indeed the international price of scrap steel, where 2/3 of the total unit cost per ton of steel is to scrap. But although surprisingly, the cost of electricity accounts for just 10% of the cost. In the blast furnace pathway, iron ore accounts for 30% of the cost, and coking coal is 25% of the total unit cost of steel. So different factors will affect the different investment decisions, as well as local environmental regulations, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of recent investments and developments in new plants, EAF plants have accounted for a significant proportion of new plants, up to 40% of the new capacity coming online between 2018 and 2020, according to OECD data. However, the EAF plants are generally, on average, a quarter of the size of a blast furnace integrated steel mill. So the decision to make to put in an EAF plant is very different to that of a blast furnace one, based on how much steel you want to produce and the broadly local circumstances. A bulk of the capacity in tonnage terms of EAF plants appears to be in Iran as well, surprisingly, where the new blast furnace and basic plants are generally concentrated more in China and India, as well as Iran as well. Although the proliferation of EAF plants is more widespread amongst more countries, still only a majority of the new capacity has been a blast furnace and option. Now, going back to the electric arc furnace, switching to EAF, however, it isn't so simple. Pardon me. Scrap steel is widely available, but the supply is not limitless. According to the Steel Recycling Institute, the recycling rates in 2014 was around about 86%, approaching 90%, and is considered the most recycled material in the world. The end product recycling from, for instance, motor vehicles is 95%, and 90% of the steel in appliances and white goods is also recovered as well. So with recycling rates so high from these bulk sources, to increase electric arc furnace production needs yet more scrap metal. And so one has to manage this very carefully. Where will it come from? So one can identify new sources, but establishing a network and system for collecting and processing scrap steel, because it still contains impurities, paints, so on and so forth. Doing this on a large scale is still a massive challenge. Scrap metal has its own market dynamics, its own pricing structure, and its own economics. For example, in China, when the price of scrap steel is high in the country, electric arc furnace plants actually use more pig iron. When the price of scrap is low, more scrap is then used in the blast furnace basic oxygen system. And so the scrap industry itself is its own profit-seeking business, and will direct steel and will attract markets based on the relative cost of scrap versus iron ore, wherever one is in the world. So there's no simple answer. A simple switch to EAF from blast furnace isn't straightforward. Now, looking to the long-term future, coal-based steel production is not going to disappear. Urban development is a significant driver for the demand of steel due to the need for infrastructure and housing, so on and so forth, bridges, commercial buildings, and so on. In 2018, more than half of the world's 7.8 billion population resided in urban areas. By 2050, the United Nations predicts the world population will grow to 9.8 billion, and 68% will live in urban areas. So it's a massive increase in urban population. a lot of this is going to happen in Asia. Industrializing Asia, as we see before, relies 80% on blast furnace and basic steel production. Of course, it can import steel from other regions, but then it can develop more electric arc furnace as well. But the electricity supplied in a lot of Asian countries is still fossil fuel based. It's not coal, it's natural gas and oil as well. So again, the answer to decarbonising the process isn't simple, and we can look at some of the options in a moment. According to the World Energy Outlook, under their sustainable development scenario, the energy transition towards a greater role for renewables is a very firm part of the future energy mix. And part of this solution will be the addition of 1,800 gigawatts of new wind power capacity in coming decades. This is a top-end estimate, of course, because it's the sustainable development scenario. But nonetheless, when one considers that 90% of a wind turbine mast is steel, and also steel is used in almost every other part of the turbine, coal-based steel could still be a very important part to supplying the raw materials for the energy transition. And my estimates suggest that if the current mix of coking coal to EAF stays the same, that the increase in coking coal demand could be 185 million tons a year to meet this increase in the need for steel. It's including a very significant proportion of the steel coming from EAF processes. So the future of coal-based steel and coking coal certainly doesn't look negative or too bad at all. Even the IEA Futures Electric scenario was published in 2018, which was a really fascinating look into what will happen to the world's energy markets with a greater degree of electrification in our society through industry. Through a greater implementation of electric heating, electric vehicle road transportation, digitization in households, and also electrifying business and industry even more. Still sees half of the world's steel production still coming from the blast furnace and basic oxygen routes in coming decades. With that said, existing steel production from the blast furnace route will still become more efficient and explore more methods of reducing coke consumption. Because steel mills are constantly investing and always investing in efficiency and recycling and efficiency. According to the IEA, and there's a very important statement, is the first fuel, and is a very important aspect. And such an energy-intensive industry such as steel is always looking for improving its energy use. But other innovations are being tested to reduce the carbon footprints in the various stages of crude steel production. Of course, one can use more scrap steel in the blast furnace process, but carbon capture storage is an interesting option. The first CCS plant on a steel facility was commissioned in 2016 in Abu Dhabi by the Emirates Steel Company, sinking 0.8 million tons of CO2 per year, and it's a first of kind system. However, Emirates Steel according to the company website, it isn't a blast furnace operator. It's a rather sophisticated rolling mill, but nonetheless, it's a very intensive process and makes use of enhanced oil recovery for local oil and gas extraction. Another possible option is using the direct reduction of ore using hydrogen, which is also being tested at pilot scale in Europe, and this is covered briefly in the report. With a long-term view of replacing hydrogen from syngas, from fossil fuels, to getting hydrogen from the electrolysis of water using renewable power, but that's very much on the horizon, isn't likely to be happening soon, but is in the development process. There's a long way to implementation. Moving towards the end of the report, the draft report, as I said, is going to be out in at least 6 weeks' time. As I said, it's undergoing editing and will have to undergo peer review. The report will look at the comparative costs between coal and non-coal based steel manufacture. There's a lot more discussion on coking coal price trends and price differentials between different metallurgical coals, so coking coal, hard coking coal, semi-soft, and PCI coals. We look at the drivers of export prices and look at what's instigated the massive swings in coking coal prices in recent years during the commodity crisis. I also look at the cost curves for the major coal exporters, see which countries are the lowest and highest cost producers of coking coal, export coking coal. And there's also country by country analysis of coking coal exporters and importers. There's more detail on the decarbonising of the steel sector and, of course, its role in wind power generation, and goes into the assumptions behind my calculations. So we finished with the key messages before I hand over to Benedict and the questions. So here we have basically coking coal is a critical raw material used for reducing iron ore. Most of the world's steel production is based on this coal-based method of blast furnace and basic oxygen. It's nearly all happening in Asia, or nearly all the growth in this respect is Asia, and that's where the coking coal trends are really being driven. The steel industry has undergone a great deal of rationalization and is probably more efficient now than before, with utilization rates increasing. But of course, we've got new capacity coming online, so those utilization rates may well increase again with the view of the exit strategies of whether steel production comes back online, back to normality in due course. The shift to electric non-coal-based systems isn't straightforward. There are many other factors to consider, other market and technical factors to consider in different regions. Of course, it will be region specific. And really, yeah, coking coal demand will not disappear, since it's really used as a processing product as opposed to just it's not a combustion fuel. Nonetheless, there will be innovations in the process, and I shall now finish there and be welcome to take questions. I'll just open up my question window. Okay, one question is, okay, I'll try and do it in order of what time they came in. So at 12:06, how long is coke stored between the time it leaves the oven and then it goes into the blast furnace? I don't think it's long at all. I don't know, actually, I'll be honest, but normally blast furnace coke goes through a quenching process, a cooling process, to create a solid structure. But the answer to that is I'm not entirely sure. In fact, a lot of the papers that I've read, actually a lot of the questions here, a lot of papers I've read don't even have that information, but I'm sure with some more research, I can find that out for you. Great question. It's something I'd like to add to my report. I don't think it's something I've got. The next question, let's have a look. From the same question, what percentage of steel mills make their own coke on site? Again, okay, that's another really interesting question, which again isn't something I've come across in many of the papers and statistics I've seen. But generally, the integrated steel mills, the large integrated steel mills, will have coke facilities on site. Coke production in China, however, seems to be its own industry. They export a lot of coke, so it'd be well worth investigating what coke facilities exist in China, because I think they are. Some of those are standalone, but generally they're on site. It makes sense to really keep the whole process, simply because the byproducts and the off gases, which I didn't really talk into, which are the mixture of hydrogens and carbon monoxide and so on and so forth, coming off the coke oven gas is reused, and it's such a valuable gas with a good heating value that it's used elsewhere on sites for generating electricity and for other heat raising processes to keep temperatures up. So this is why steel mills are so highly effective at recycling material. Arguably, I saw a figure somewhere that 90% of the raw materials on an integrated steel mill is recycled and reused. It's quite a staggering level of sort of a circular economy approach to heavy industry. So that sort of partly justifies why you'll find more coke ovens on site. I'm afraid somebody's had an audio problem. I think if there were technical problems at my end, my team would have probably cut in and told me they couldn't hear. I'm good. Okay, now fine. Mongolia's coke and coal exports are railed to China. I thought that significant goes by road. Actually, that a significant portion could go by road. And yes, they've got truck routes. And I think, but maybe Hugh, if you could tell me what that proportion is, that would be great. But to my recollection and my data, I think the long-term future of Mongolian exports is to go via some of the major coal terminals on the southern part of the country, which is on the China side of the border, from which they've got excellent rail routes. But yeah, no, road is another option. Lots of questions here. I may well be cut off, but I will try and address the questions. So if you want to email the self of the company, that would be good. Let me just, here's the next, there we go, there's my email address. If you want to email your questions, please do. We can see the recycling steel further increasing as we move away from plastics. The challenge is that collecting and recycling facilities are not central. We need to incentivize scrap collectors. Indeed, in fact, the incentives in China to recycle are highly variable. There are anything up to 20,000 small-scale collectors in China and a group of larger scale. But if the money and the incentives aren't there, there'll be no collection. There's no incentive to buy and sell. It's rather like, for those of you who may be more familiar with oil refining, the crude oil going in and the refined products coming out, if the price differential isn't attractive, the incentives, of course, disappear, and it makes the situation more difficult. But thanks for that comment from, yeah. So I'll just scroll down. Other than the energy consumption of the different technologies, are there differences in the quality of the final steel produced? Absolutely. I believe that the high ash coking coals in India are a bit of a problem, and I think that can cause the quality of the in their direct reduction process as well as blast furnace can cause quality issues in the pig and sponge iron. Of course, yes, you need to get the quality up to a certain level. You need to get out oxygen as well as the silicates using lime and limestone in the various stages of the processes. Because if you have too many contaminants in the steel, at the end of the crude steel process, the alloying elements you put into the final crude steel would then react with the contaminants, and then you spent money on alloy materials which are then being wasted. So yeah, the quality process, the amount of oxygen and temperature one manages in the basic oxygen furnace it is all computer controlled and very, very carefully done. Sorry if I've missed any questions. As I said, I have got a time limit on this because I'm scrolling through and there's so many questions here. What proportion of scrap comes from scrap strips? Good question. I'm afraid it's not a maybe scrap steel's another report from you, Lee. Good question. It's slightly out of the scope of the report, but yeah, that's an interesting. I've got a feeling it's a very high percentage. I'm going to throw a number in. I'm going to say 15–20%. A lot of mainly comes from automotives. But no, indeed, it all depends. Of course, then you're going into a question of what's the scrap rate in steel of ships on a year-to-year basis. Is the shipping industry going to maintain its older fleets, or is it going to reduce its fleet because shipping rates are too low, charter rates are too low, so therefore you increase scrap. So again, you've got a different set of scrap price and incentives and dynamics for scrapping ships. I'm afraid answer that question. I'm going to move on to a new question. Sorry if I just skipped a few people here, but Travis, what's the views on recovery versus non-recovery coke batteries? I'm afraid I don't quite. When you mean recovery, do you mean energy? I'm not too sure. I'm afraid I don't fully understand that question. Okay, the DRI process. Okay, I'll be honest, I'm not a metallurgist, so I'm not an expert, but it's DRI is a solid state process. The temperatures are just below the molten stage of iron ore. And the coal and hydrogen, the reduction process, I believe, actually, I think it's mainly the carbon, I believe, but the hydrogen process is a more advanced process, which reacts with the, pardon me, the oxygen, and I assume it emits then water. That's to be the sort of future of the DRI process. But it's basically a solid state system which produces something called sponge iron, which is unusual looking up in. It sort of looks almost like pumice. It's highly susceptible to rusting, so it needs to be processed very quickly and has to get into the blast furnace, the EAF furnace, very quickly. That's what I know. But in terms of the technical details of the DRI process, I've got it more, probably more in the report, but I'd recommend maybe further reading on that. Dave Jones, investors are very likely that investors will shift their gaze towards, I think that question may have been sent before we completed the sentence. Apologies, Dave. If you want to send your query through, email it through. Do you expect more stringent environmental regulations around coke ovens? There already are, I think. The steel industry has regularly been asked to close or stop operating in parts of around the world. In China, for instance, I believe the Hubei province, I think they are going to have a political summit in one of the local regions, and steel production has been asked to be cut in half because of the air quality regulation, because of the air quality and reducing the pollutions, because of the presence of high-level politicians will be in the region. So they will, the regulations will obviously be a feature. I think the answer is yes, inevitably. Environmental regulations rarely get loose. Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Okay, apologies. I've got so many more questions. I hope we can keep this on record. But I've got the system online. Perhaps I can answer by typing in. I've still got access to the question and answer. But I'll hand over to Benedicta. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. The slides from this webinar will be available to download from the webinar page shortly. And all there's left to say from me is the next webinar from us will be on Wednesday, the 10th of June at the same time, 12 noon. It'll be on the impact on and perspective for coal under ETS or carbon tax schemes, and will be presented by Stephanie Metzger. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and goodbye.